The church has left the building. This was a big key part of it, was that the church is a building, or the church is the people and not the building. When I was in the 6th grade, my family actually moved from the Kansas City area to Ontario, Oregon to plant a church. We lived in Ontario when I was born, so I lived there till I was 0 till about the 2nd grade, and then we ended up moving away. And my parents had these high leadership jobs at a very, very big church in the Kansas City area. But we ended up moving, after a few years there, back to Ontario because they said God is calling us to plant a church. So we planted this church through the Church of God. And the building was one thing that was rarely consistent about this church. We started out in a middle school, a small room, just a few people. I remember doing the youth stuff in the gymnasium there while worship was going on. And then after that, we moved into this larger room at the local cultural center. But we had more people at that time, and the production was getting bigger. We had this trailer of stuff that we would tow with us every week up to the cultural center, and we would unload the stage and the lights and the sounds, and we would set up all the chairs for everybody, and then we would do sometimes 2 worship services, and then at the end, we'd pack it all back up, put it in nice boxes, back into the trailer at the end of every day so that we could have it stowed away for next week. It was a lot of work when we were there. It was a big process doing that. Eventually, we found a little bit more of a permanent home in a strip mall on the edge of town, and I can remember still the smell of the Mongolian barbecue, which was right next door. They liked having us there. We would just pop over all the time. It was great. But the building, that wasn't the most consistent part of the church. That changed all the time. But like I said, the motto was, the church has left the building. And that was one of the things that this church really emphasized. We called the church Origins Faith Community. We actually didn't call it church, we called it a faith community on purpose. And Origins Faith Community would go out into the community regularly. We would go out and we would walk in the Thanksgiving parade of the town, and we'd push a bunch of shopping carts around and collect cans for the local food drives. We would fill up boxes, like shoe boxes, with Christmas gifts for kids whose families might not be able to afford it, kind of like we do with our giving tree. And we would have the biggest spring festival on Easter weekend for the whole community, bigger than anything else was putting on, with massive Easter egg hunts and inflatable bouncy houses and food and games, the whole 9 yards. And we even started an event called Serve Day, which started in 2008 with about 200 Christians doing service projects around the area. And it grew and grew and still is going on to this day. In 2019, it had over 1,000 volunteers doing over 100 projects, painting fences, houses, cleaning up yards, all sorts of things like that, building accessibility ramps for people all around the area. It's still the biggest day of service in the Treasure Valley that I know of. And while we got really good at this part of going out into the community, that wasn't the most interesting part about Origins. The most interesting part about Origins was the community that came to us. See, we gained a reputation pretty early on as that church with those people. Yeah. We had some people that we knew. Like I said, I was born in Ontario, and at that time, my parents worked for the Nazarene Church. Well, my dad did. My mom worked for the Nazarene Church. But they were youth pastors, so we had some people who they had known from their time before that came back when we moved back and planted Origins. And we also even had some people move from Kansas City area to Ontario with us to be part of this church process. But that wasn't the majority of the church. The majority of the church was really poor. We had a lot of people who spent their fair share of nights outdoors or didn't know where their next rent payment was going to come from. That was a big part of it. We had a lot of people who were struggling with addiction. In fact, we were the only church in the town that the local recovery center would allow their inpatients to come to on Sundays. And we had a lot of people who were disabled mentally or physically, and we had a lot of people who would be even recently released from the prison, which is there in Ontario, the Snake River Correctional Institute. It's the biggest prison in Oregon. So we had this all sorts of weird group of people. It wasn't unusual for, on a Sunday morning, me as a young teenager to be walking through and seeing someone who was still drunk from the night before, or maybe even almost passed out. Maybe they were high. We had to call the cops sometimes. Like, that happened a couple times. We had kids in our children's program that had, some special needs, to the point where other churches in the area kicked them out, told their families, we can't deal with that. We can't handle it. So they got kicked out, and they came to Origins. And as more and more of those people came to Origins, more and more of them followed. And as I think about that crowd of people at Origins, it reminds me so much of the parable from the gospel today. Because we've got these groups of people that are, first the king throws this party and he goes out and he invites all the people that you'd expect to be invited, and they don't come. And he says, okay, go out in the streets, just invite anyone you can find. Bring them into the party. Let's imagine that this story played out. It's just a parable, but let's imagine if it played out. When I think about that possibility, I have so many questions. First of all, how might that have played out for the king's servants or hired help? Do you think that when they went out in the streets, do you think maybe they passed anyone by instead of giving an invitation? Like maybe someone just looked a certain way, or maybe they smelled a certain way. Do you think that they hesitated, even just for a second, to put out the good dinnerware? Do you think that there were any moments of like passive aggression when someone like didn't know the right etiquette for something? Do you think they maybe gave some helpful hints that were friendly but not so friendly? I could see stuff like that playing out. What about the people who were invited from the streets that would normally never be invited to such an event like this? How do you think it felt? I wonder, like, how comfortable would they be walking into a palace? Do you think they poured through their closets trying to find something appropriate to wear? Do you think they worried if they went in that they might forget to wash their feet or something like that? Do you think that maybe even they could have been anxious that the whole thing was a joke or a prank or some sort of trap? And I wonder about the king, too, who's throwing this party. Like, if one of those guests forgot a piece of etiquette or forgot to wash their feet, I wonder how the king would have responded. Would he have ignored it and just moved on like nothing happened, or do you think he would have fixed it? Do you think that the king, being that it was his child's wedding, would have worn his nicest robe? Or do you think he would have changed into something that might have matched a little bit better with what his new guests were going to be wearing? Do you think when they came in, do you think the king greeted them with a hug and a kiss, or do you think he might have waved from a safe distance? I don't know. It's a parable, it's a story. I don't know how it plays out. But I can tell you how it played out at Origins Faith Community. All these people, the poor, the disabled, the recently released from prison, the addicted, they came in to Origins. They didn't come in because we had a sign on the front that said, "Addicts welcome," or "Houseless folks welcome." They walked in because the moment they stepped in the door, we had people there who shook their hand and looked them in the eye, and they didn't flinch for a second. They didn't flinch. They saw them as a whole person right away. And I think people walked into Origins because as soon as they stepped in the door, they saw people who were kind of like them. If they had tattoos, they saw other people with tattoos. If they had their 30-day chip around their neck, there's probably someone else there with that too. In fact, I'll bet they could even find someone with a matching fancy GPS ankle bracelet courtesy of the sheriff's office. It wasn't that uncommon. And they found people in there that were dressed like them. They would come as they were. They would come as they were comfortable. They'd wear their t-shirts, their basketball shorts, their sweats, their sweatshirts. They would wear things that were tight-fitting and things that were loose-fitting. I remember in the sanctuary when I was just in middle school overhearing a conversation where clothes in church came up, and someone said, no, not here. This is our church. We come as we are. God does not care what we wear to church. Oh, I love that. And I think that the people came to Origins because when the worship team came on and we sang songs, it sounded something like they might listen to on the radio, and they didn't have to be able to read music to sing along. In fact, they probably didn't even have to be able to read to sing along to some of the songs. And I think that the language of the worship service was common for them. I think that it didn't speak down to them, but it also didn't go over their heads. I'm telling you about Origins today because there are ways in which St. Andrew has collided with Origins Faith Community that we might not all even be aware of. If we fast forward in the story of Origins a few years, we get to about 2018, which is this year where I got hired at this crazy place called St. Andrew. And I said, hey, Mom, you are a youth leader at Origins. I am now a youth leader at St. Andrew. Wouldn't it be cool if we did a joint trip together? Let's go on a trip. So a few years ago, that's exactly what we did. We planned a trip for summer of 2019, and we were going to go down to California. We had plans to go to this Christian school in Northern California, and it fell apart kind of last minute. So we ended up scrambling and trying to find something else that we were going to take our kids to go do. And Pastor Robin connected me with Reverend Megan Rohr down in San Francisco. Reverend Rohr was, a few years ago, elected as the first trans bishop in the ELCA. So Reverend Rohr ended up hosting us at their church down in San Francisco for the week, and they helped us find service projects, and they helped us get a tour of the city where we got to learn about the inequity going on, like how the Capitol building was plated with gold while there's homeless people all around it. And it just so happened also that the week we were going, remember, we weren't planning to go to San Francisco. The week we were going was Pride Week in San Francisco. Oh boy, yeah. So we were going down to San Francisco, and Reverend Rohr helped us find ways to experience Pride Sunday, the day of the parade and whatnot. And we started out that day by going to Glide Memorial Church, which is a famously inclusive church. And there was a sermon preached that was not only an inclusive sermon, but it was an explicitly pro-LGBT sermon, which for the folks of us that came from St. Andrew, wasn't so big of a deal, didn't really shock us. The folks coming from Origins, a little bit of different culture, it was a bit of a shock. I remember turning around and leading a kind of group conversation after the service was over and kind of helping our group get back on the same page and take some deep breaths, because it was a lot for some of us. And then after we walked out of Glide Memorial Church and we went down to the Pride Parade. And we stood there and we watched the whole parade, and we had a fantastic time. We had a blast all together. In fact, Origins had a student with them who was gay at the time, and Origins also had my younger sibling with them who came out just a couple months after this trip. And when we got done with this whole trip in San Francisco, we all drove home, us to Portland and them back to Ontario. And we had these events at our churches to tell our congregation about this trip that we went on. At St. Andrew, it happened right over there in the fellowship hall. And it was just a few of us that actually ended up going from St. Andrew. More came from the other church. But we told everyone about our week and about how impactful it was and how cool it was to be part of that Pride Parade and all these things. And it was great. Everyone was so happy. Everyone was celebrating with us. It didn't go quite the same over in Ontario. In fact, people got pretty mad. So mad, in fact, that a lot of people left the church, and not just walked out quietly, they got angry. I mean, they might as well spit in my mom's face for taking those kids to such an event. They lost a lot of people. It reminds me actually of the stories I hear sometimes of when St. Andrew called Pastor Robin. And it just so happened, too, that these people who left the church happened to be the people who had most of the money in the church, including people who moved halfway across the country with us to start a church. So following that, we lost a large portion of the church, and they were trying to figure out where to go, and they lost a lot of the money. And as they were trying to kind of rebuild back up with this base that was very much on board with the direction of the church, very excited about where they were going, and then COVID hits. All right? And as things went with a lot of churches, giving dropped significantly, and it got to the point where they said, hey, we actually can't afford to pay pastors anymore. So it was time for my parents to move on, and they moved on during the pandemic to their next thing. But as the traditional side of Origins was winding down, another side was ramping up. They partnered with the owners of the lot next to them to build and support this community of tiny homes. And they had showers put in the building so that they could come over and they could take showers. And they served over 100 hot meals a day to people in the community who needed it. And that has continued until Friday, which is one of the reasons why I'm here talking about this, because I'm processing a little bit. Origins Faith Community closed down, finally, on Friday. And it wasn't their own doing. The Church of God, which Origins was planted through, had got some new leadership in the Northwest, and basically they said, you're not having a Sunday morning worship gathering anymore. You're not a church, and they pulled their 501c3 funding. I know. So when the 501c3 funding got pulled, they lost all of their grant money. The people that were working there lost their jobs. The chaplain that would come in and sing songs with people and pray with people and listen to them no longer could be paid to come in and do that. The whole thing was completely shut down because they said, you're not really a church. That makes me so mad and sad. I think there's such a warning there of like, whoa, what happens if we get so tied up in our own idea of what it is to be, like that we become so obsessed with our formula for the church that we lose the church altogether, right? Whew, that's a scary thought. That the tradition can become so overwhelming, the way we've always done things, that we miss where God is taking us next. I think about the parable today from the gospel reading, and I think about the people who are invited first. The king knew who he wanted to invite. He goes out, invites all the people, probably people you'd expect, but they're invited, and they say, I got something better to do, or I'm really busy, or I have these other priorities, or maybe it's not their kind of party, you know? We've all had those days. But I think the message from this gospel story, this parable, is pretty clear. Party's going on. The party's going to happen. The church is going to happen. It's going to keep going, whether it's inside four walls or at a restaurant or out in the forest, whether it's the people you expect to be there or the people that you don't expect to be there. The party is going to go on. I want to be at the party. You want to go to the party with me? Cool. I'll see you there.